Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Well, this was the first week of school for so many people, and I begin every week, I don't know about you, I begin every week with a really long to-do list. And I know a lot of kids came home from school and they had all these huge lists. In fact, I can't believe the amount of work they give kids over the summer before school starts, okay? I personally, as a child, would have considered that to be unfair, that the teachers, you get September through June. July and August is my time, okay? So I never really understood that. But, you have the kids, they come home with the long lists of reading, long lists of assignments, and there's all these things they have to do, and then parents back to coordinating all these drop-offs and pickups and all that kind of thing. And I know just in the work world, right, I start my week with a long list of things that I hope to get done out of the week, and my prayer is that there will someday be a week where I actually finish all the things that are on my list. And if you're like me, you start out and you start thinking, okay, what are my priorities? All right, what do I have to do? But we often get in the trap of thinking that our priorities are time-based in that way, that somehow our priorities are centered around what we need to do first, as opposed to what's actually more important. Okay, and so that is a tension that we often have in our lives. And I hear a lot of people speak about this and talk about how the urgent gets in the way of what's actually important, and how so often that thing that isn't actually the most important thing we have to do becomes the thing that, through a sense of urgency, rises to the top of the list. And this competing idea of what priorities need to be in our lives is what Jesus is getting at in this passage, where he delivers a pretty tough teaching. Now, it's a teaching that's geared, one of the things I mention often is that whenever we listen to what Jesus is saying, we have to remember who he's speaking to. Because you don't speak to people the same way who are in different circumstances, just like teachers know, right? You don't teach a first grader the way you teach a 12th grader, the way you teach a graduate student. It's different, all right? In your workplaces, right, you speak to people differently depending on what their perspective is and where they're coming from. And so whenever Jesus delivers a teaching, it's really important for us to remember who it is that he's talking to, because the nature of his teaching is different when he's talking to his disciples versus talking to opponents, versus talking to regular people. And this is a teaching that he delivers to large crowds. And that's why they tell us this, by the way, because they're reminding us in the scripture by giving us this setting where they're reminding us the audience to whom Jesus is speaking. And so he's speaking to large crowds. And the implication here is that the large crowds are just kind of following him. This is not his committed band that's been with him all along. The large crowds are people who are kind of saying, hey, this looks cool, I've heard about this guy is famous, he seems to be doing a lot of great things. And so these are people who are mostly checking him out. Okay, so they're checking him out, they see the flash, all right? And Jesus is trying to say, before you get too wowed by the flash, before you get too wowed by the healings and the feeding and the stuff that seems cool, let me tell you what this is really about. And because he doesn't want people who are coming to faith simply because they're in it for what they can get from it. All right? That is not what he's looking for. He's not looking for people who are in it for what they can get from it, but rather he wants them to understand the importance of what it is that they're doing. And so he begins with this really not crowd-friendly statement. He goes, so all of you, I see all of you gathered. It's great. There's a great crowd, It'd be like, waiting for Easter to deliver that message, right? So you go on Easter, you have everybody here and go, let's start the service by saying, by the way, if you don't hate your father and mother, your wife and your children, your brothers and sisters, and even life itself, why don't you go home? We wouldn't say it till after the offering. But really, that's what he's doing. He's basically saying, look, if you're not in it, with this attitude, if you don't hate your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, you can't follow me. You can't learn from me. Now, this is hyperbole. He is trying to shock them out of what they thought they were getting themselves into. They thought they were in for a pleasant ride. They thought they were in for some nice teaching. They thought they were in to get the sick healed, and they thought they were just going to get themselves fed. They thought they were in for that, and he's saying, no, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. Now, hate is a tough word, and hate has a lot of meanings, and even though it's a word we don't tend to like to use, it's a word we often do use in situations where we don't really mean hate. And hate in the Greek has that same variation of meaning that it has in English, which is sometimes we say hate as in, you're my mortal enemy and I hate you, or it can also mean, I love vanilla ice cream and I hate chocolate. Okay? All right? And so it can simply express that the idea that what you hate is what you prefer less. So it's got that full range of meaning from an absolute enemy hatred to I simply prefer you much less than something else, and so I'm going to use that word hate. So it's got that full range, and I suspect that what Jesus means here is the preference. That what he's simply saying is that your preference for your parents, for your families, for your siblings, and even for your own life has to be reduced. That if those are the things that are absolutely first in your lives, you will have a hard time actually being my disciple. Now, that still sounds kind of tough to our ears, all right? That's not necessarily a friendly teaching. But the reason for that is because when he's establishing the priority of following him, he's establishing a why. And this is what I want to impress upon you, is the idea that priorities are about why we do things. We often think of priorities in terms of timing, that we think of priorities in terms of things we need to do first. My first priority is the thing I need to do before I do something else. But rather, the priorities as we understand them in faith are priorities of importance. Okay? It's kind of like when Ford had that big campaign, right, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, quality is job one. Okay? They were expressing the idea that making a quality car was the top priority. It wasn't about doing it first. It was about that had to guide everything else. And so when you do that, and when you say that that is your first priority, then you understand that everything you do has to be in the service of doing that. Okay? And so he was saying priorities are, it's about a why. That you need to be following me as your why. Your why has to be about being my follower before it's about those other things. Okay? It couldn't be a person coming in and saying, well, I heard he gives out a lot of food, and so I'm going to follow him so I can get food for my family. At that point, what you're doing is you are making the family first, and you're making the faith a tool of that. Okay? As opposed to the other way around. As opposed to saying that the reason I'm following is to follow. That the most important thing about following you is following you. Okay? It's not about what I can get from you to serve something else. It's about following you in and of itself. Okay? Because we have to understand that the lesser serves the greater. All right, the lesser serves the greater. And if your first priority in life isn't God, what is it going to be? I mean, for a lot of people, their first priority is prestige, or their first priority can be money, or their first priority can be love. But whatever that is, everything else begins to serve it, and it can make those pretty unhealthy desires if everything else serves that. And so in this orientation of your life toward what needs to be the first priority, there can be a cost. And what Jesus says is you have to understand what that cost is going to be. So he tells these stories where he says, look, if you're intending to build a tower, don't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether you have enough to complete it? You have to know what it's going to entail. And then you have to make a simple decision. Is what it's going to entail worth it? Is it worth it? And worth it is actually the ultimate thing that you worry about here, because something that we often forget is that cost is not a loss. See, often we think about cost, or we hear the word cost, and it strikes us as cost just means I'm losing. All right? Costs are not loss. Costs are about trades. Okay? A cost is about a trade. Okay? The cost of a car is how much money am I willing to trade in order to get a car. Okay? It's not just loss. Loss is giving away. Okay? Cost in terms of transaction means trade. And so what we're always doing is saying, okay, is this worth it? Am I going to get what I'm giving? Am I willing to pay that? And when it comes to our lives, when Jesus said, you have to be willing to prefer your life less, it reminded me of a great line. Remember that movie Braveheart? I hope you all saw Braveheart somewhere along the way, okay? And when Mel Gibson gives that stirring speech to his troops as they're about to go into what's clearly, objectively, probably a losing battle, as he gives that speech, and the way he talks about dying was great. He says, you can run, and if you run, you'll probably die someday in your bed of old age. And he said, but then what he said was, are you willing to trade all the days from now until then for freedom? And I thought that was the best way to think about what it would mean to give your life for a cause, all right? Because it was a trade. I mean, after all, we're all going to die, okay? So when you talk about losing your life, it's like, it's not a matter of whether we're going to lose our lives. We are. We're going to die. By the way, if that's shocking to you, I hope not. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. We're all going to die. Okay? The issue is not whether we're going to die, right? The issue is when. And so I thought the way he phrased it was really good. This idea that what you would be doing in laying your life down for freedom is trading all the days from that day to the day you would die in your bed of old age, in exchange for a chance at freedom. Are you willing to make that trade? Okay? And so we have to think about whether the things we would trade in order to follow Christ are worth it. And we always trade lower priority things for higher priority things. All right? That's the way it works. We trade lower priority things for higher priority things. That's the basis of trade. Okay? And so what he says you need to be willing to do is to say that everything that you own, everything that you have, is something that you would trade for the more important thing, which is to follow Christ. And so he comes in at the end of this passage with a statement that seems to come out of the blue, because when was he even talking about this, right? He says you have to hate your father and mother, hate your brother and sister. And then he says, so therefore, I didn't even think you were talking about my stuff. I thought you were just talking about my family. Therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. Now that sounds tough. It sounds really tough, and it's also not what he literally means because, quite frankly, they didn't. Okay, they still had some possessions. I mean, later on, they're following Jesus, and he's like, don't take more than one cloak, or, don't take. So clearly, they still have stuff, so they didn't give it up. So let me unpack for you what the words kind of actually mean in terms of translation. All right? So let's unpack the language. Give up is a word that didn't necessarily mean give away. It meant renounce your interest in. All right? To give up is renounce your interest in. Renounce your interest. And possessions was actually everything at your disposal. This is like the third time in the last 6 weeks that this word possessions has come up in the text. And each of those 3 times I've had to mention that the word possessions, the way it's translated into English, it's translated as a noun, as a thing. But in the Greek, it's actually a verb. It's a verb, it's a participle talking about everything you possess. So you have to renounce all that you are hanging on to, all that you are possessing, all that you are controlling, everything that you have at your disposal, all right? And it's about the control. So essentially when he says you have to give up all your possessions, what he's basically saying in the Greek, what's more literal, is to say what you have to do is renounce your control of everything. Renounce everything you're controlling. Renounce everything at your disposal. Renounce your interest in controlling everything. And then you start thinking about it and you go, what happens then? What happens if you renounce your interest in everything that you're controlling? What controls it? God. So if you put God first and you say, I'm going to renounce everything, renounce my interest in everything that I have at my disposal, everything that I can control, then what you end up doing is saying that what I'm going to do is put God first in my life, which means I'm going to let God control all of it. All right? I'm going to let God control all of it. Instead of me controlling everything, I'm going to let God control everything. I'm going to put all of my interests, all of my control at the disposal of God, which allows God to be the one who is controlling, who is driving what I do with my things. And if God becomes the purpose, if God becomes the force that is driving what you do, you haven't lost it. And you haven't diminished it. In fact, what you've done is you've elevated it. See, putting God first doesn't diminish everything else in your life. Putting God first and making God the driving point, the driving force of what you do, elevates everything else. Because it gives everything else then a divine purpose. I mean, if you only live for yourself, what good is that? Because as I said, you're going to die. So if you only live for yourself, you're living for something that is temporary. You're living for something that's going to end. Okay. But if you renounce your interest in preserving that, you renounce your interest in controlling your life, and you put it in the service of God, what do? You elevate it. You elevate it in purpose to something that is greater. And we talk about this all the time in all kinds of circumstances, that when we do things for God, it takes what we do and makes it greater. Right? Whatever it is, whether it is the music that the band performs, when you take it and you put it toward God, it makes it greater than it was, right? When you take the effort, when you take the love of your family, when you understand that your children are a gift from God and your investment in your children is divinely appointed and a part of living into God's purpose for you and your family, it elevates that relationship. When you take your work and you see whatever it is that you do for a living as being something that is a part of your faith, it takes whatever you do for a living and it makes it greater because it gives it a higher purpose. When God is your first priority, it to me takes everything else in your life and puts it in the service of that first priority, and instead of diminishing it, it elevates it. And so what Jesus is saying is, in a tough passage, is that everything that you want to put first is actually diminished when you put it ahead of God. But when you put God first and you take everything and put it in the service of God, it elevates it to something that plays a role in the divine management of this world. And so instead of serving you, or worse, instead of you serving something that isn't God, take everything you have, take everything you do, and think of how it serves God. Think of how it serves a role in the divine purpose for the universe. And then it takes all those things and elevates them to something higher. It makes it worth it. So let God be your job one. And it will make everything else greater than it was before, not lesser. Amen.